The ledger of the overseer lay open upon the desk, its pages a testament to neat columns of numbers and names. Yet on that morning, March 14, 1851, it was an entry by Thomas Garrett that would become a spectre for all his days to come. Within the space reserved for the unusual, he inscribed only 4 words. Asterisk another white infant found. Asterisk. It marked the 7th in just 3 months. Across 2,000 acres of Alabama cotton country, 20 miles south of Montgomery, sprawled the Henderson plantation. Within its boundaries lived and labored 300 souls, most of them enslaved, their existences measured in bales picked and rows hoed. For 40 years, the plantation had operated without incident. It stood as a model of efficiency, studied and envied by other landowners. The enslaved population remained stable, the yields consistent, the books balanced to the very penny. Then the babies began to appear. The first was discovered on a frigid January morning by a woman called Ruth, who shared cabin number 12 with her husband, Daniel, and their 3 children. Rising before dawn to fetch water from the well, she heard it, a thin, reedy cry emanating from the doorway of the abandoned cabin beside her own. Cabin 13 had stood empty for months, ever since its previous occupants were sold down the river to settle a debt Colonel Henderson incurred during a poor harvest. Wrapped in a flour sack and placed with care upon the rotting floorboards just inside the door, Ruth found the infant. The child was perhaps 2 months old, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the pre-dawn gloom and a shock of blonde hair so fine it was nearly white. The baby was clean, well-fed, and dressed in a cotton gown of simple make, yet far finer than anything the enslaved population might access. The stitching was precise and even, the kind that demanded both time and skill. For a long moment, Ruth stood in the doorway, the January wind cutting through her thin dress as she stared at the child. In her world, the unexpected was inherently dangerous. A white baby appearing in the slave quarters was precisely the kind of event that could bring trouble down upon everyone, guilty or otherwise. But she was a mother, the baby was crying, and some instincts run deeper than fear. She picked up the child and brought it to the overseer's house. For 12 years, Thomas Garrett had managed Henderson Plantation. He was a methodical man of 43, neither cruel nor kind, who viewed his position as one requiring organization and strict attention to detail. He had come to Alabama from Virginia, where he learned plantation management under his father, who'd run a smaller operation in the Tidewater region. Garrett prided himself on running an orderly establishment. The enslaved were healthy and productive. The equipment was maintained, the books balanced. The Colonel's trust had been earned through years of consistent, reliable service. To him, the appearance of an unexplained infant was, first and foremost, an administrative problem. White babies did not simply materialize in slave quarters. Someone had to have brought it. Someone had to know, and it was his job to discover who and what. In his office, a small building adjacent to the main house that served as the plantation's nerve center, he questioned Ruth extensively. The room was spare and functional, a desk, 2 chairs, shelves lined with ledgers documenting every aspect of the business. Ruth stood before him, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the floor as she had been taught. Had she seen anyone near the cabins during the night? No, sir. Had she heard anything unusual? Footsteps, voices, a horse or wagon? No, sir. Did she recognize the flour sack or the gown? No, sir. When exactly had she found the child? Just before dawn, sir, when she went for water. Was there anything else unusual? No, sir. With increasing nervousness, Ruth answered each query, aware that in the world she inhabited, being the bearer of strange news was perilous. She knew nothing. She had seen nothing. She had simply found the child and done what she thought was right. Garrett believed her. He had managed enslaved workers long enough to recognize a lie, and Ruth's fear was genuine and uncomplicated. She was as mystified as he. Garrett sent word to the main house, where Colonel Marcus Henderson and his wife resided. The colonel was in Montgomery on business, something about renegotiating a cotton factor's contract, but Mrs. Elizabeth Henderson came down to the overseer's office within the hour. A tall woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, she possessed sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Born into one of Virginia's old families, she had brought both money and connections to her marriage. She was known for running the household with the same efficiency her husband applied to the fields, managing the house servants with firm but fair discipline. With a practiced eye, she examined the infant, her long fingers checking the baby's limbs, peering into its mouth, feeling the texture of the gown. Mrs. Henderson had raised 4 children of her own and overseen the births of countless enslaved infants on the plantation. She knew babies, and she knew quality. "This child has been well cared for," she stated, her voice crisp and certain. "Look at the skin. No rashes, no neglect. Bathed regularly, fed properly. And this gown, this is quality cotton, and the stitching is excellent. Someone with means has been tending this baby. Someone with access to good cloth and the skill to sew it." "But who would leave it here?" Garrett asked. "And why in the slave quarters? If someone wished to abandon a child, there are orphanages in Montgomery, churches that would take it. Why bring it all the way out here and leave it in an empty cabin?" Mrs. Henderson had no answer. She wrapped the baby more securely and arranged for a house servant to prepare a basket with supplies. "I shall take the child to the county orphanage myself," she said. "Mrs. Whitfield will know what to do. As for who left it and why, that is a question for you and my husband to answer, Mr. Garrett. I suggest you begin investigating immediately." She assumed the matter was closed. An unfortunate incident, certainly, but not unprecedented. Babies were abandoned all the time for all sorts of reasons. This one would be cared for and eventually placed with a family. Life would go on. But 3 weeks later, it happened again. This time, the baby was found in cabin 7, discovered by a man named Joseph when he returned from the fields at dusk. Joseph was a field hand in his 30s, strong and reliable, known for his steady work and quiet demeanor. He had been married once, but his wife died in childbirth 5 years earlier, and he had never remarried. He lived alone in cabin 7, a small structure at the northern end of the quarters. Pushing open his door that evening, exhausted from a long day clearing a new field for spring planting, he found a white infant lying on his sleeping pallet. The same circumstances as before, a white baby, perhaps 3 months old, wrapped in clean cloth, placed carefully as if to ensure it would be found immediately. The child was healthy, fed, and calm, its blue eyes staring at the ceiling with the unfocused gaze of the very young. Frozen in his doorway, Joseph's mind raced through the implications. A white baby in his cabin. If accused of stealing it, of harming it, of anything at all, he could be killed. The fact of his innocence would mean nothing if the wrong person made an accusation. Yet hiding the baby or trying to move it would look worse. He had no choice but to report it immediately. With hands that shook slightly, he brought the baby to the overseer's house and handed the infant to Garrett. Now Garrett felt the first stirrings of genuine unease. One abandoned baby could be explained as a desperate mother's last resort, a tragedy born of poverty or shame. 2 suggested something more deliberate, more organized. Someone was choosing to leave these babies specifically at Henderson Plantation, specifically in the slave quarters. But why? He questioned Joseph with the same thoroughness applied to Ruth and received the same answers. Nothing seen, nothing heard. The cabin had been empty at dawn. The baby was there at dusk. No one else had been inside. Joseph was certain he kept his few possessions in a specific arrangement, and nothing had been disturbed save for the baby on his pallet. This time, Garrett conducted a more thorough investigation. He walked the slave quarters that night, checking for signs of unusual activity. He examined the ground around cabin 7 for footprints or wagon tracks. He questioned other residents, asking if anyone had seen strangers or noticed anything out of the ordinary. He examined the wrapping cloth, searching for any identifying mark, a laundry mark, a particular weave, anything to indicate its origin. He found nothing. The cloth was good quality but unremarkable. The quarters had been quiet. The ground showed only normal traffic. The second infant joined the first at the orphanage, delivered by Mrs. Henderson with a deepening sense of concern. 2 abandoned white babies in 3 weeks, both found in the same location. It was beginning to look less like coincidence and more like a pattern. Colonel Marcus Henderson returned from Montgomery 2 days later and was briefed on the situation by both his wife and his overseer. A practical man of 58, he had built his fortune through careful planning and calculated risk. He had inherited a modest plantation from his father and expanded it through shrewd land purchases and efficient operations. Respected in Montgomery society, he served on the boards of 2 banks and was frequently consulted by other planters on matters of agriculture and labor. The appearance of unexplained white infants on his property represented both a mystery and a potential scandal. If word spread that babies were being abandoned at Henderson Plantation, it could damage his reputation and, more importantly, his business relationships. People might start asking questions. They might wonder if something about his plantation attracted such activity. They might speculate about what was happening in his slave quarters to make someone choose his property. Double the night watch, he ordered Garrett. I want men patrolling the quarters every hour after dark. Post them at both ends and have them walk the full length each hour. Whoever is doing this will be caught. They must approach from somewhere, the road, the fields, the woods. Someone will see them. But the night watch found nothing. The patrol saw nothing. 2 men walked the quarters every hour from dusk until dawn, reporting no unusual activity. The quarters remained quiet, routines undisturbed. The enslaved population retired and rose at their usual times. No one came or went who shouldn't have. And yet, 3 weeks after the second baby appeared, there was a third. This one was found in cabin 19, in the southern section of the quarters farthest from the main house. A woman named Hannah discovered it when she woke to feed her own infant in the middle of the night. Hannah was 24, mother of 3, married to a carpenter named Samuel. Known as a light sleeper, a trait honed by years of tending to babies, she had heard no footsteps, no doors opening, no sounds of any kind. Her husband slept beside her, snoring softly. Her 3 children slept on their pallets in the corner. But there, in the other corner of the cabin where nothing had been before, lay another white baby, wrapped in the same type of clean cloth, wearing the same type of simple but well-made gown. Hannah's scream woke half the quarters. By the time Garrett arrived, a crowd had gathered outside cabin 19. The enslaved population's fear was now palpable in the cold March air. In their world, unexplained events were dangerous. Strange occurrences drew attention, and attention from the white overseers and owners was rarely good. Whispers spread through the crowd, whispers of spirits and curses, of omens and hints. Some of the elders remembered stories from childhood, tales of supernatural beings that moved unseen, leaving signs of their presence. Others spoke of warnings, messages from the dead, punishments for unnamed sins. With sharp orders, Garrett dispersed the crowd, sending people back to their cabins. He could not afford panic spreading through the quarters. Frightened workers were unproductive workers, and the spring planting season was approaching. He needed everyone focused on their tasks, not jumping at shadows and spreading wild stories. He took possession of the 3rd infant and brought it to his office. This time, examining the baby more carefully in the lamplight, he noticed something he'd missed before: a small birthmark on its left shoulder, a distinctive port wine stain in the shape of a crescent moon. It was the kind of mark a mother would recognize instantly, an identifying feature that could not be hidden. He made a note of it in his ledger, adding to the growing file on the mysterious babies. 3 infants in 2 months, all white, all healthy, all well cared for, all appearing overnight in slave cabins despite increased security. It was beginning to feel less like a criminal matter and more like something he could not quite name, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up when he thought about it too long. The 4th baby appeared in early March, found in cabin 23 by an elderly woman named Sarah, who had lived on the plantation for 40 years. She discovered it at dawn, placed just inside her door as if someone knew she would be the first to wake. Sarah was known as a healer, knowledgeable in herbs and remedies, called upon when children fell ill or women faced difficult labor. She looked at the white baby with eyes that had seen too much, wrapped it more securely, and brought it to Garrett without a word. The 5th came a week later in cabin 4, found by a young couple married just 6 months. The sixth was discovered in cabin 16 by a man who worked in the stables. Each time, the pattern held a white infant, healthy and well cared for, appearing overnight in or near a slave cabin with no explanation. Each time, despite increased patrols and heightened vigilance, no one saw or heard anything suspicious. The enslaved population grew more frightened with each discovery. Work in the fields became tense. Productivity dropped. Garrett found himself managing an increasingly anxious workforce. People were afraid to sleep, afraid to wake, afraid of what they might find. The white overseers and drivers were equally unsettled. In a world built on control and order, the babies represented chaos, something happening that could not be explained or prevented. Garrett increased security again. He posted guards at the entrances to the quarters. He had men patrol the plantation boundaries. He even brought in dogs, thinking they might alert to strangers, but nothing worked. The babies kept appearing, and no one could explain how. In mid-March, Colonel Henderson called a meeting of his senior staff: Garrett, Benjamin Cross, the head driver, William Porter, the stable master, and Margaret Sullivan, his wife's personal assistant, who managed the household staff. They gathered in the colonel's study, a room lined with books and ledgers representing 40 years of careful record-keeping. "Gentlemen and Mrs. Sullivan," the colonel began, standing behind his desk, hands clasped behind his back. "We have a problem that defies conventional explanation. 6 white infants have appeared on this plantation over 2 months. Despite our best efforts, increased patrols, guard dogs, constant vigilance, we have no idea who is leaving them or why. This situation cannot continue. It affects productivity, morale, and my reputation. I need solutions, not excuses." "Could it be someone from outside the plantation?" Porter suggested. "A lean man in his 40s who'd worked with horses all his life," he continued, "someone using our property as a convenient dumping ground. Perhaps someone from Montgomery who knows the layout." "The patrols would have seen them," Garrett replied. "We have men watching the roads and boundaries. No one has entered or left the plantation at night without being logged in the gate book. I've checked every entry personally. The only people coming and going are authorized, merchants making deliveries, neighbors on social calls, all during daylight hours." "Then it must be someone inside," said Cross, a hard man who had been head driver for 8 years, ruling through intimidation and strategic cruelty. "Someone who knows the routines and can move unnoticed. Someone with access to the quarters." "But who?" Mrs. Sullivan asked. A woman in her late 30s, educated and sharp, she had been with the Henderson family for 15 years. "And more importantly, where are these babies coming from? 6 infants do not simply appear from nowhere. Someone is giving birth to these children, and someone is caring for them before they're abandoned. That requires resources, food, cloth, time, privacy. Where is all this happening?" It was a question no one could answer. The implications were staggering. If someone on the plantation was hiding multiple babies, they would need a secure location, supplies, and help. It could not be done alone. But if multiple people were involved, how had they kept it secret? How had no one noticed? "There is another possibility," Mrs. Sullivan said quietly. "What if the babies aren't being hidden on the plantation? What if they're being brought here from somewhere else? Somewhere close enough that the person can make the trip in a few hours, but far enough that we wouldn't think to look." "You mean Montgomery?" the colonel asked. "Or a neighboring plantation? Or a house in the countryside? Somewhere within a few hours' ride?" The colonel considered this. That would require someone with access to transportation, a horse or wagon. Someone who could leave their location at night and return before dawn without being missed. Or someone who has a legitimate reason to travel, Garrett added. A merchant, a doctor, a minister. Someone whose comings and goings wouldn't be questioned. The meeting continued for another hour but produced no concrete answers. The colonel made a decision. "We'll conduct a census. Every person on this plantation will be accounted for and examined. If there are women who've recently given birth, we'll know. If supplies are being diverted, we'll find them. If there are hidden spaces where babies could be kept, we'll discover them. This mystery will be solved. The census began the next day. A massive undertaking, 300 people to be documented, questioned, and, in the case of women of childbearing age, physically examined by Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Robert Chambers, the plantation's physician. Dr. Chambers, a man in his 60s who had treated the Henderson family and their enslaved population for 20 years, was thorough and professional, but the examinations were deeply invasive and humiliating for the women subjected to them. The process took nearly 2 weeks and was deeply unpopular. The enslaved population resented the intrusion, the questions, the physical examinations. The fear that had been building since the first baby now mixed with anger and resentment. Garrett could feel the tension in the quarters, see it in the averted eyes and whispered conversations when overseers passed. The results were baffling. Every woman who had given birth in the past year was accounted for, their children matched the expected descriptions. There were no hidden pregnancies, no unexplained absences suggesting a secret birth. The supplies were all accounted for: cloth, thread, food stores. Nothing was missing beyond normal usage. The cabins were searched, outbuildings examined, even the surrounding woods combed for hidden structures or caches. They found absolutely nothing. And yet, on the night the census was completed, an 8th baby appeared. This one was found in cabin 9, discovered by a young woman named Clara, who had lived alone since her mother's death the previous fall. Clara was 17, quiet and withdrawn, known for keeping to herself. She worked in the main house as a laundry maid, one of the few enslaved people with regular access to the household's inner workings. Small and thin with large, dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should, she did not scream or raise an alarm when she found the baby that morning. Instead, she picked up the child, wrapped it more securely, and sat with it until morning, rocking it gently and humming a tune her mother had taught her years ago. When Garrett arrived, alerted by another resident who had seen Clara sitting in her doorway with a white baby, he found her still rocking the child. Something in her expression gave him pause, something beyond the fear and confusion he had seen in the others. This was a deep, profound sadness, as if Clara understood something the rest did not. "Did you see who left this child?" he asked, his voice gentler than usual. Clara shook her head slowly, eyes never leaving the baby's face. "Did you hear anything during the night? Any sounds at all?" Another shake of the head. "Clara, I need you to tell me if you know anything about these babies. Anything at all. You won't be punished for telling the truth, but I need to know what's happening." Clara looked up at him then, and Garrett saw tears streaming down her face. "They're lost," she whispered. "All of them. They're lost, and someone's trying to save them." Save them from what? But Clara would say no more. She handed over the baby and retreated into her cabin, closing the door. Disturbed, Garrett stood outside for a moment. There had been something in Clara's voice, something suggesting she knew more than she was saying. But he could not force her to talk without risking worse. He reported the conversation to Colonel Henderson, who ordered Clara brought to the main house for questioning. But when Cross went to fetch her an hour later, he found cabin 9 empty. Clara had vanished, taking nothing but the clothes on her back. A search party was organized immediately. In 1851 Alabama, an enslaved person disappearing was a serious matter, not just a financial loss, but a challenge to security. If Clara had run, others might follow. If she had been taken, it spoke to failed security. If she was hiding on the property, she needed to be found before she came to harm. They found her 3 hours later, hiding in the old tobacco barn on the eastern edge of the property. The barn hadn't been used in years, not since the colonel shifted entirely to cotton in the 1840s. It was a large, decaying structure with a collapsed roof and walls that let in the wind. Clara huddled in a corner, shivering from cold and fear. Cross dragged her out roughly, but Garrett intervened. "Carefully," he said. "The colonel wants to question her, and he can't do that if she's injured or too frightened to speak." They brought Clara to the main house, to the colonel's study, where Henderson, his wife, and Garrett waited. Clara stood before them, thin and trembling, eyes fixed on the floor. She looked even smaller in the grand room, surrounded by books and furniture representing wealth beyond anything she would ever know. Colonel Henderson studied her for a long moment before speaking, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Clara, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to punish you for running. I just need you to tell me the truth. Do you know where these babies are coming from?" "No, sir." "Do you know who's been leaving them?" "No, sir." "But you said something to Mr. Garrett. You said they were lost and someone was trying to save them. What did you mean?" Clara was silent for a long moment, her thin shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "My mama used to tell me stories about the old days, before she came here. She said there were places where babies weren't wanted. Where they were born and then given away, hidden, made to disappear." "What kind of places?" Mrs. Henderson asked, leaning forward. "Big houses. Rich houses. Places where a baby being born at the wrong time or to the wrong person would cause shame. She said sometimes the babies would just vanish, and no one would ask questions because asking was dangerous." "And what happened to these babies?" the colonel asked. "Sometimes they died. Sometimes they were sold. Sometimes they were given to people who would take them far away, where no one would ever know where they came from." Clara's voice grew even quieter. "Mama said it was one of the secret things. One of the things everyone knew about but no one talked about. She said the big houses had lots of secrets, and the babies were just one of them." The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. Colonel Henderson exchanged a long look with his wife, and Garrett saw something pass between them, a recognition, perhaps, or a shared understanding of something he wasn't privy to. "Are you suggesting," Henderson said slowly, "that these infants are being abandoned here because someone wants to hide their existence? That they're illegitimate children from wealthy families?" "I don't know, sir. I'm just telling you what my mama told me. That sometimes, when people have secrets they can't keep, they find places to hide them. Places where no one will ask questions. Places where the babies might be found and cared for, but where the scandal would be contained." It was a theory that made a terrible kind of sense. The Henderson plantation was isolated enough to be discreet but established enough to have connections to Montgomery society. The colonel and his wife attended social functions, did business with prominent families, moved in circles where reputation was everything. If someone in that world needed to dispose of an inconvenient infant, the product of an affair or a pregnancy that would ruin a reputation, the plantation slave quarters would be an ideal location. The babies would be found and cared for, but the scandal would be contained. But it was just a theory. There was no proof, no evidence beyond the babies themselves and Clara's second-hand stories from a mother now dead. Colonel Henderson sent Clara back to the quarters with a warning to keep her speculations to herself and to never run again. Then he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the ledgers on his desk. Finally, he looked at Garrett. "I'm going to Montgomery. I'm going to speak with Sheriff Crane. This has gone beyond a plantation matter. If what Clara suggests is true, if someone in Montgomery society is using my property for such purposes, then the law needs to be involved." He left that afternoon, riding hard for the city. Garrett watched him go, then returned to his office and made another entry in his ledger. *8 babies in 10 weeks. Still no answers. But that night, something changed. The 9th baby appeared. And this time, there was a witness. A young stable hand named Marcus, unable to sleep due to a stomach ailment, had left his cabin around midnight to relieve himself in the woods behind the quarters. Returning, he saw a figure moving through the quarters, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Dressed in dark clothing, the figure moved with purpose toward cabin 12, the very cabin where the first baby had been found months earlier. Marcus watched as the figure paused at the door, placed the bundle inside, then turned and walked quickly back the way it had come, not toward the road or the woods, but toward the main house. Waiting until the figure was out of sight, Marcus ran to cabin 12. Inside, he found the 9th baby wrapped in the now familiar clean cloth. He immediately went to wake Garrett. By the time Garrett arrived, Marcus was agitated and frightened, stumbling over his words, but his story was clear. He had seen someone leave the baby, someone who had come from and returned to the main house. Garrett felt his blood run cold. The main house. Not an outsider. Not someone from Montgomery. Someone who lived on the plantation. Someone with access to the main house. Someone who could move through the quarters without raising suspicion because they belonged there. He questioned Marcus extensively. Had he seen the person's face? No, too dark, they'd worn a hood or bonnet. Man or woman? Thought it was a woman based on movement, but couldn't be certain. Height? Average. Anything distinctive? Nothing. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had before. Garrett made Marcus swear to keep quiet, then took the baby and sat in his office, thinking. Someone from the main house. That narrowed the possibilities considerably. The main house staff consisted of about 15 people, house servants, cooks, personal attendants, all of them enslaved except for Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Sullivan. Could it be one of the house servants? But they were all accounted for, watched closely by Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Sullivan. Their movements were tracked, duties supervised. It would be nearly impossible for one of them to hide a pregnancy, give birth, and care for multiple babies unnoticed. Unless they weren't hiding the babies on the plantation at all, unless they were being brought from somewhere else, as Mrs. Sullivan had suggested. But that required transportation, access to a horse or wagon, the ability to leave and return unnoticed. Garrett sat in his office until dawn, turning the problem over. Then he made a decision. He would watch the main house. Not obviously, but he would pay attention to comings and goings, to who had access to transportation, to who might have opportunity to travel without raising suspicion. When Colonel Henderson returned from Montgomery 2 days later, Garrett briefed him on Marcus's sighting. The colonel listened in silence, his face growing more troubled with each detail. "Did you speak with the sheriff?" Garrett asked. "I did." The colonel's voice was heavy. He was less than helpful. He suggested pursuing this matter too aggressively might cause problems. He implied there are people in Montgomery who would not appreciate questions about illegitimate children and abandoned babies. He refused to investigate. He said he would make discreet inquiries, but made it clear he expected those inquiries to lead nowhere. He said, some mysteries are better left unsolved, for everyone's sake. Garrett felt a chill. "Sir, are you saying the sheriff knows something?" "That he's protecting someone." "I'm saying Sheriff Crane is a political animal who's held his position for 15 years by knowing when to look the other way. And he's made it clear this is one of those times. The babies are being cared for at the orphanage. They're safe, they'll be adopted. As far as the sheriff is concerned, no crime has been committed. Abandoning a child isn't illegal if the child is left where it will be found and cared for. So we just let this continue." Colonel Henderson was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to tell you something in confidence, Mr. Garrett. Something that doesn't leave this room. The sheriff suggested to me that if I were to discover who was leaving these babies, the best course would be to quietly make it stop. Not to prosecute, not to make a scandal, but simply to ensure it doesn't happen again. He said that would be in everyone's best interest, mine, the plantations, and Montgomery societies. He's asking you to cover it up. He's asking me to be practical. And perhaps he's right. Perhaps the best thing for everyone is to solve this quietly and move on." But Garrett couldn't let it go. That night, he began his surveillance of the main house. Positioned in the trees behind the building, he could see the back entrance and the path to the quarters. He watched for 3 nights and saw nothing unusual. Servants came and went on normal schedules. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Sullivan moved about their duties. Everything appeared routine. On the 4th night, he saw it. Around 11 o'clock, a figure emerged from the back door of the main house, a woman in a dark cloak, carrying a bundle. She moved quickly and quietly down the path toward the quarters. Garrett followed at a distance, staying in the shadows. the woman went to cabin 7, Joseph's cabin, where the second baby had been found. She placed the bundle inside, paused as if listening, then turned and walked quickly back toward the main house. As she passed through a patch of moonlight, Garrett got a better look. It was Mrs. Sullivan. Garrett stood frozen, his mind reeling. Mrs. Sullivan, the Colonel's wife's personal assistant, trusted implicitly, with access to everything. She was the one leaving the babies. But why? And where were they coming from? Garrett waited until Mrs. Sullivan had returned to the main house, then went to cabin 7. Inside, he found the 10th baby wrapped in the familiar cloth. He picked up the infant and brought it to his office, his mind racing. He had to tell the Colonel. But what then? Mrs. Sullivan would be questioned, possibly arrested. The scandal would be enormous. If these babies were connected to prominent families, the fallout could destroy the Colonel. Holding the baby as dawn broke, Garrett made his decision. He would confront Mrs. Sullivan first, privately. He would learn the truth before involving the Colonel. Perhaps there was an explanation. He waited until mid-morning, when Mrs. Henderson would be occupied and the Colonel in the fields. Then he went to the main house and asked to speak with Mrs. Sullivan privately. They met in a small sitting room off the main parlor. Mrs. Sullivan looked calm and composed, showing no sign of guilt or nervousness. She sat in a chair by the window, hands folded in her lap, and waited. "I saw you last night," Garrett said without preamble. "I saw you leave the house with a baby and place it in cabin 7. Mrs. Sullivan's expression didn't change. "I see. I need you to tell me what's happening. Where are these babies coming from? Why are you leaving them in the quarters?" Mrs. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, studying him. Then she sighed. "Mr. Garrett, there are things in this world better left unknown. Secrets that, once revealed, cause more harm than good. I would advise you to forget what you saw and let this matter rest." "I can't do that. 10 babies have appeared in 3 months. The enslaved are frightened. The Colonel's reputation is at risk. I need answers." "And if those answers destroy lives? If they ruin reputations and tear families apart, would you still insist on knowing?" "The truth is the truth, Mrs. Sullivan. Whatever it is, it needs to come out." Mrs. Sullivan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds. When she spoke again, her voice was soft and sad. "The babies are from Montgomery. From families you would recognize, families with names and reputations that matter in this state. They are the children of affairs, of indiscretions, of moments of weakness that produced consequences their parents cannot acknowledge. So Clara was right. They're illegitimate children being hidden to avoid scandal. It's more complicated than that, Mr. Garrett. These aren't just unwanted babies being discarded. They are children whose very existence threatens their family's standing. If their births were known, marriages would be destroyed, fortunes lost, reputations ruined. The mothers can't keep them, and the fathers won't acknowledge them. So they are brought here, where they'll be found and cared for, but where their origins will remain hidden." "And you're the one bringing them? Why? What's your connection?" Mrs. Sullivan turned to face him. "Because I am one of them, Mr. Garrett. Or I was once, before I came to work for the Hendersons. I lived in Montgomery. I moved in society, attended the same parties, knew the same people. And I made the same mistake some of these women are making now. I had a child I couldn't keep, a baby that would have destroyed my family if its existence became known. Someone helped me then, helped me hide my shame and find a place for my child. Now I do the same for others. But why here? Why the Henderson plantation? Because Mrs. Henderson knows. She has known from the beginning. This is done with her permission, with her help. She provides the cloth, the supplies, the means to care for the babies before they're placed. She ensures they're taken to the orphanage and placed with good families. She does this because she understands what it's like to have secrets, to need help, to be desperate." Garrett felt as if the ground had shifted. "Mrs. Henderson is part of this. She is the reason it's possible. Without her help, these babies would be left to die or sold to people who would treat them as commodities. This way, they have a chance at a good life. They're adopted by families who want them, who will raise them as their own. It's not perfect, Mr. Garrett, but it's better than the alternatives. Does the Colonel know? Mrs. Sullivan hesitated. No. And he can't know. If he learns the truth, he'll feel obligated to act. He'll report it, and the scandal will destroy everyone involved, the mothers, the families, even the babies. The children will be marked as bastards. Their adoptive families will be questioned. Their entire lives will be tainted. Is that what you want? Garrett sat down heavily, his mind reeling. This is wrong. All of it. The deception, the secrecy, using the plantation without the Colonel's knowledge. It is mercy, Mr. Garrett. Imperfect mercy, perhaps, but mercy nonetheless. These women have nowhere else to turn. If we don't help them, their babies will die or disappear into situations far worse than an orphanage. We are saving lives. By lying to everyone. By frightening the enslaved. By risking the Colonel's reputation. The enslaved will recover. The Colonel's reputation is intact, no one outside knows, and the sheriff won't pursue it. And yes, we're lying. We're lying to protect people who made mistakes, who are desperate, who have no other options. Is that so terrible? Garrett didn't know how to answer. Everything she said made a kind of sense, but it still felt wrong. The deception violated the order and honesty he'd tried to maintain. What happens now? He asked finally. That depends on you. You can go to the Colonel and tell him everything. The operation will end. The women will have nowhere to turn, and the babies will suffer. Or you can keep this secret. Let the last few placements happen, and then it will be over. There are only 2 more babies to place. Then the women involved will have moved on, found other solutions. This chapter will close, and life will return to normal. And if I agree to stay silent, I become part of the deception. You become part of the mercy, Mr. Garrett. You become someone who chose compassion over rules, who understood that sometimes the right thing isn't the legal thing or the proper thing. You become someone who saved lives. Garrett sat in silence, wrestling with the decision. Finally, he looked up. 2 more babies. And then it stops completely. No more placements. No more secrets. And if the Colonel ever asks me directly, I won't lie to him. Agreed. Garrett left the main house feeling as if he'd aged years in a single morning. He'd sought truth and found it, but the truth was morally ambiguous. He'd become complicit in a conspiracy aimed at saving lives. He'd chosen to deceive his employer in service of a greater mercy. He didn't know if it was right. He suspected he'd spend the rest of his life wondering. The 11th baby appeared a week later in cabin 16. The 12th and final baby was discovered 2 weeks after that in cabin 4. Both times, Garrett knew it was Mrs. Sullivan, but he said nothing. He documented the findings, arranged for the babies to be taken to the orphanage, and kept his silence. After the 12th baby, the placement stopped. No more infants appeared. Slowly, the enslaved population relaxed, though the memory lingered. Work returned to normal. Life on the plantation continued as before. Colonel Henderson never learned the truth. He assumed the responsible party had been frightened off by the increased security and the sheriff's involvement. He was satisfied the problem had resolved itself. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Sullivan never spoke of it. The secret remained locked between them. Garrett kept his silence but never forgot. In his private journal, he recorded everything, sealing the pages with wax and hiding them in a locked drawer. He wrote that he didn't know if he'd done the right thing, but he hoped that somewhere 12 children were growing up safe and loved, unaware of the desperate circumstances of their births and the complicated mercy that had saved them. The 12 babies were adopted from the orphanage over the following 2 years. Mrs. Whitfield, the orphanage director, kept careful records and ensured each child went to a good family. She never knew the full story but suspected there was more to it. She kept her suspicions to herself. Years passed. The Civil War came and destroyed the old order. Henderson Plantation was burned during a raid in 1863. The colonel died shortly after, his fortune and world were gone. Mrs. Henderson survived but lived in reduced circumstances, dependent on charity. She never spoke of the babies. The secret died with her in 1869. Mrs. Sullivan moved to Mobile after the war and worked as a teacher. She never married, never had other children. She died in 1881, taking her full knowledge of the conspiracy to her grave. Thomas Garrett continued as an overseer until the war made his profession obsolete. After emancipation, he worked as a farm manager and eventually retired to a small house in Montgomery. He died in 1889. His journal was discovered among his effects. His children read it with shock and confusion, unable to reconcile the story with the father they'd known. They debated, then decided to burn it, believing some secrets were too dangerous to preserve. But before burning it, one of Garrett's daughters copied the key pages, hiding them in her own diary. That diary survived and was eventually donated to a historical society in the 1940s. The pages were discovered by a researcher in 1963, but by then, everyone involved was long dead, and the story couldn't be verified. It remained a curious footnote in the history of antebellum Alabama, a mystery that might have been true or might have been the imaginings of a troubled man. The 12 babies grew up, lived their lives, and died without ever knowing their true origins. Some had children and grandchildren, spreading their bloodlines across Alabama and beyond. They were teachers, merchants, farmers, craftsmen, mothers, and fathers, ordinary lives marked by ordinary joys and sorrows. But in their blood, they carried a secret. They were the children of scandal and desperation, saved by a conspiracy of women who understood that sometimes mercy requires deception, and that sometimes the right thing is the thing that can never be acknowledged. The slave quarters of Henderson Plantation rotted away, reclaimed by the soil. The main house was never rebuilt. The land was sold and resold, divided until nothing remained of the plantation that had been a model of efficiency and order. But the question remained, whispered in dark corners of Montgomery society, passed down like a ghost story that might be true: what really happened in those slave cabins in the spring of 1851? Where did those babies come from? And what terrible secret was so important it had to be erased from history? The truth, as Garrett discovered, was both simpler and more complicated. It was a story of desperate women and impossible choices, of secrets that couldn't be kept and children who couldn't be acknowledged. It was a story of mercy offered in the only way possible, through deception and conspiracy. It was a story of people trying to do right in a world that offered only wrong choices. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, that sometimes the only way to save something is to hide it, that sometimes love looks like abandonment and mercy looks like cruelty, that sometimes the people we think we know carry secrets so heavy they change the shape of their souls. The Henderson Plantation is gone now, marked only by a historical plaque mentioning cotton production and Civil War history. It says nothing of white babies appearing in slave cabins. Nothing of mysteries never officially solved. Nothing of the 3 months in 1851 when something inexplicable happened, then stopped, then was systematically erased from every official record. But the land remembers. The soil remembers. And somewhere in the fading pages of hidden diaries and the whispered stories of descendants, the truth still exists, waiting to be found, or waiting to remain hidden forever. Because some secrets, once buried, are meant to stay that way. And some truths, once known, can never be unknown. The 12 babies of Henderson Plantation were saved by a conspiracy of silence. They lived because people chose mercy over honesty, compassion over rules. They survived because women who understood desperation helped other women in their darkest hours. And they never knew. They never knew their lives began in scandal and were saved by deception. They never knew their very existence was a secret so dangerous it had to be hidden in the one place no one would think to look, among the enslaved population of a cotton plantation in Alabama. That was the genius of it. The one place where white babies would be noticed but not questioned, found but not investigated, cared for but not claimed. The slave quarters were the perfect hiding place for the unwanted children of Montgomery society because no one would ever imagine that the wealthy and powerful would use such a location for such a purpose. It was a conspiracy born of desperation and maintained through careful planning. It was mercy offered in the shadows, salvation delivered in secret. It was wrong and right at the same time, a moral paradox that defied easy judgment. And it worked. 12 babies were saved. 12 lives were given a chance. 12 secrets were kept. Until now. Until this story was told. Until the truth, buried for more than a century and a half, was finally brought to light. But even now, questions remain. Were there other plantations used for similar purposes? Were there other conspiracies of mercy operating in the shadows of antebellum society? How many other secrets are buried in the soil of the South, waiting to be discovered or waiting to remain hidden forever? We'll never know. The people who could answer are long dead, their secrets taken to graves that have themselves crumbled to dust. All we have are fragments, a journal entry here, a diary page there, an orphanage record that raises more questions than it answers. And perhaps that's how it should be. Perhaps some stories are meant to remain incomplete. Some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. Perhaps the truth is too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too human to be reduced to simple facts and clear judgments. The babies of Henderson Plantation were real. The conspiracy that saved them was real. The desperate women and the compassionate conspirators were real. The fear, the secrecy, the moral compromises, all real. And somewhere in Alabama, there are people walking around with this story in their blood. Descendants of those 12 babies, carrying a mystery they don't even know exists. That is the legacy of Henderson Plantation. Not the cotton it produced or the wealth it generated, but the lives it saved and the secrets it kept. Lives that mattered. Secrets that shaped the future in ways no one could have predicted. And that, perhaps, is the most shocking truth of all, not that white babies appeared in slave cabins, but that they were placed there deliberately as part of a conspiracy of mercy that saved lives while hiding the truth. Not that a mystery existed, but that it was solved and then deliberately buried again because the truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. That's what they finally found. Not a simple answer, but a complicated truth. Not a clear villain, but a tangle of desperate people making impossible choices. Not a scandal to be exposed, but a mercy to be protected. And in the end, the secret was kept. The babies were saved. And life went on, carrying the weight of hidden truths and unspoken mercies into a future that would never fully understand what happened in those slave cabins in the spring of 1851.